All right. Well, a new report in England shows that some male prisoners pretend to be transgender in order to be transferred into women's prisons. You don't say. This is something that people have been warning about. Now, this seems like kind of an obvious study, but there's some things in here that make me very uncomfortable, and I want to go over it because this is something that affects single-sex spaces, not just prisons, but civil rights as well, things that we all should care about. So if you're like, well, who cares what happens to prisoners? One, you still have civil rights, even if you are a prisoner. And two, this has implications for all single-sex spaces. So let's go over this. Now, the full report hasn't been published yet, but it was commissioned by the Ministry of Justice in the UK, and preliminary findings were published by a prisoner's publication called Inside Times. Now, interestingly, this study was commissioned in order to study how to better protect transgender prisoners. It had nothing to do with protecting women's prisoners or women's spaces. It literally was there to study how to better serve their needs. So that's where that money went. But what they found is that there is this idea of real trans people versus fake trans people. And you can see this conundrum, right? We're talking about biological males identifying as women. And it's really tricky concept to say some of them are real and some of them are not. Now, there is a pathology for gender dysphoria that normally happens in young boys as young as 4, and 80% of the time it resolves itself by full puberty. If it does not, and it persists, a lot of times this is a biological male phenomenon more than it is a biological female phenomenon. So there is such a thing as an adult person who still is gender dysphoric and wants to live as this. So we are talking about two real categories, but what many of them are saying is that these biological males are faking it. Why this matters is because it says that the type of people who are more likely to switch genders are sex offenders. Look at this quote from the study. The figures show that men jailed for sexual offenses are twice as likely to identify as trans women compared with men jailed for other types of offenses. Now, you would think it's just kind of obvious. If they committed their sexual crime with their penis, they should stay in a male prison, right? If they committed that crime as a male, they don't get to then switch. That seems pretty stinking logical. If when they were convicted, let's say a transgender adult who has been dysphoric since childhood and maybe was doing sex work or other kind of like whatever, for whatever they're in prison, drug offenses or something like that, but that happened as a woman, then we are talking about two distinctive groups. Again, this tracks with a 2020 study that shows that transgender women, we're talking about biological males, still display a male type pattern of criminality because women's violence is very different. Can we put that chart up? If you take a look at this study from 2020 that shows that. So male sexual predators might want to be in spaces, with only women. Who would have thought? Oh, maybe everyone who understands sexual predators. Some of the fakers, they say, thought that if they identified as women, they'd have an easier life because, not so many, I guess, scary fellow prison inmates. Also, they thought that they could opt out of some of the rehab classes that they had to do while they were still categorized as male offenders. So I'm just assuming that what that means is, if you've sexually assaulted people, you have to take, classes as a male sexual assault person. And maybe you don't have to if you say you're a woman. Does that make sense? But there is also, again, this group of trans people saying that fakers harm their reputation and safety. And you can see how that probably would be the case if you're someone who's been just dysphoric your whole life and has lived your whole life as this person with dysphoria. And then someone just says, oh, yeah, me too, and then follows you into the women's spaces, right? here's the quote from that study. There's this theme in the findings related to the participants having to prove their authenticity and also question how genuine or fake other transgender prisoners were. The researcher says participants described how the fakers were both a threat to the reputation of prisoners who were transitioning gender and also a threat to the limited resources available to them in custody. But again, my issue with this is not that like some are fake and some are real, although that's an uncomfortable discussion. And it's increasingly uncomfortable because there's no burden of proof any longer. We used to have this burden of proof where you had to have been dysphoric for 2 years. You had to have displayed these certain markers. For whatever reason, we've decided that's not necessary anymore. And you can just identify with how you feel. And so now, people are poking, like they're making a joke out of it. Like, just let me throw on some lipstick and say I'm a lady. Ricky Gervais' most recent episode of his, what's the name of his show? Afterlife. I have not seen it, but I watched the first 2 seasons. Sort of pokes fun at this. Is just like, throw on a wig, call yourself trans, get all the perks, right? But again, these lines are blurred, and there's this, we're framing this around men, though, biological men. Nowhere in the study are we saying, does this make it less safe for women? And that I think is problematic because the very study was done to protect only trans people and not the existing population. And so if we then replicate these studies in schools, then we're never going to look at how this affects the single sex population or, for lack of non-transgender people. I'm not going to use the word cis. Go ahead, David.
Is there any data showing it the other way where trans men are going into men's prisons, like requesting that and not being women's prisons? Are we seeing that at all?
I have not seen it. I have not seen it. And I don't know why you would, right? Unless to get yourself killed.
Right, but that just proves the point that it would be better to be in a woman's prison.
True.
Whether you're man or female. I mean, if they're not requesting to go in with men, then that means something is obviously, worse in the men's prison than women's prison.
Maybe. I watched 1 episode of Orange is the New Black and decided I was not in for that. So maybe that's true. Maybe that's not. I don't know. I have done no field research. Now, there's no winning this game of distinction of who's real and who's not. Like, it really just leaves us this option of creating a third space. And when former Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was asked how we know who is a safe trans person and who is not, she basically said, wait until they commit violence and then we'll see, which is like using a woman as bait. So, even if we're talking about female prisoners, though, they still have human rights. And a lot of times when you put male sex offenders in these single sex spaces, it's the women who are already there who become less safe, not the already existing trans women. And it's the most powerless populations who were harmed by gender ID. This reminded me of this statement in April by the Black Women's Caucus. They released this statement against gender ideology because they say Black women and girls are a more vulnerable population, particularly in the United States, and therefore need safer spaces to be protected. They point out that 1 in 4 Black girls are sexually assaulted before the age of 18. 35% of Black women report physical abuse and violence. And so policies that allow men unfettered access to female designated facilities put Black women and girls, a demographic disproportionately impacted by male violence, at an even higher risk. Also, Black women are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered than men by men than white women. And this is why the fight against gender ideology is pertinent for Black women. This statement says we are the demographic most in need of protection from male violence. So when you think of how these studies are framed, of how we can protect the trans people, we don't even look at it from which vulnerable populations will be at risk. We also know that Black people are more likely to be incarcerated in the U.S., so putting men in these prisons is another risk factor for Black women and girls. But new rules in the UK no longer allow biological men to self-identify into women's prisons. That doesn't mean this is the last of this debate that we've heard, but I'm interested to see this full study when it comes out because, again, it's interesting in the fact that we're even, that we're even allowing for this category of fakers, right? I think it maybe makes the conversation even harder rather than easier. But at least there is this idea that there always historically has been a way to identify the pathology of gender dysphoria, and we somehow have forgotten it. It's clinical. It's been in the books for years and years. Trans activists just don't like it, and so they've thrown it out. So let us know what you think of that study in the chat below, and share it with your friends and like it if you have enjoyed this conversation or got something out of it.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.